All right, so thank you for having me here. It's quite an honor to speak with you today. I want to talk with you a little bit about two pieces of advice I'm going to give you as you're looking at podcasting as an opportunity as a news organization. Two things I need you to keep in mind. So I've started about 140 podcasts. I realized the other day I was kind of totaling it up. About 50 of them still exist, and I've made just about every mistake in the world. So hopefully you can bypass a lot of my mistakes. And I want to tell you a little bit about what inspires me to think about things in a way to cut through so much noise that's in the podcasting industry. There are 350,000 podcasts in iTunes in 100 languages, 14 million episodes of content. So why do we need 350,001 with your new podcast? And how can you find a way to distinguish yourself? It's actually pretty easy. So for those of you who don't know, this is Iggy Pop, punk icon. This picture has been hanging above my workplace for 20 years. I find him to be an inspirational character for a lot of ways, but the reason I keep it above my workplace is to make sure I'm keeping things real and I'm being honest with myself. And I want to tell you a story about Iggy, though there's lots of great stories, and that's really about his hatred of broccoli. In his rider for his contracts, he insists that a bowl of broccoli florets be placed in his dressing room so he can throw them away. That's it. If you do a Google search or YouTube search for Iggy Pop broccoli, you will see many videos of taken in concert with him with a head of broccoli around his neck. He uses that broccoli to inspire himself to not settle for okay, not settle for fine. I have my own version of Iggy's head of broccoli, Richard Branson. I'm sure Richard is a very nice guy, but to me, Richard Branson is an avatar for sameness. Last year, Richard Branson appeared as a guest on a podcast more than 30 times. And I say more than 30 because as I went through and searched, I eventually got so depressed, I stopped counting. And I stopped counting in the 30s. So the reason that sameness is a problem is in a world of 350,000 podcasts, how do you find a way to create something that stands out, that is meaningful, that can find an audience? And so this has led me to thinking that there's two pieces of advice I would give to a news organization that came to me and said, we're thinking about starting a podcast. Okay? The first one, news is not inherently interesting. News is great. It's not just the fact it's news. I myself, and I have seen so many organizations make this mistake over and over and over again of, oh, we have a feature coming out on Sunday. Let's start up a podcast, or let's take our podcast and let's have the reporter being interviewed by someone who they don't know, and we'll just kind of talk about the story to get people interested in the story that's coming out on Sunday. That's not inherently interesting. Just taking public radio has time and time again made the mistake of compiling stories and just feeding it as a podcast, right? One of the reasons that I am so excited about Lisa's podcast, The Daily, is it, to me, is the first time someone has kind of cracked this open on a daily news basis. So it's not the first people to try. This actually has been tried a number of times. So a podcast needs to have one or more of three things in order to be successful. It has to have a compelling idea or story. It has to have engaging characters. And as Andrea pointed out, an engaging character can be a host. And it has to have a unique voice. And that unique voice is what's so critical. It has to have something that feels so right in that space, that feels to someone that's listening to it that this was made for me in this space. The thing that's so interesting about a podcast to me, having worked in radio for so long before I became so immersed kind of by accident in the podcasting industry in 1996, I mean, there was hardly anybody doing this at that time, is that it's not, radio has always been thought to be a really intimate experience. But for a podcast, someone's putting something in their ear. You are physically inside someone's body. And that's an amazing thing to me. And it breeds a kind of intimacy that even exceeds what we think of from traditional radio broadcasting. That unique voice is so critical. It's what separates off things that people try from things that actually work. So while the compelling story is important or idea is important, The engaging character is important, that unique voice. And when you listen to The Daily, you heard it in the clips there. You heard things, even when I heard that Trump clip, which I hadn't heard, that was amazing. I've been in the news industry, I've actually been in the audio industry for more than 20 years, and I'd never heard anything like that until just now. It's a unique view. And starting with that question of what does the New York Times sound like is the same as trying to ask what's its unique voice. The second thing I want you to keep in mind, and again, you do these two things, you are in the door at the 98th percentile by doing this, 99th percentile. When I started working on a draft of this, I showed it to my wife, and it originally said, you're in the top percentile, or I said, no, the first percentile, thinking that was the top. She's like, no, that's down here. You really want it, so 99th percentile. The other one is having a story to tell isn't as important as how you tell it. If you have a unique voice, you have engaging characters, and you have a compelling story or idea, just having an interesting story isn't enough. One of the most common mistakes I've made in my life is I have done this repeatedly. I've done some successful things, so I'm telling you about all these terrible things I did, but many times I would sit down and I would talk to someone about a story I was working on, and they would find it amazing. And then they would listen to my audio version of it, and they're like, I don't care about this the way I did when you were telling me this. And I kept hearing this over and over and over again. Your produced version isn't as good. And I realized that I didn't need to work on my story finding skills. I didn't need to work on my reporting skills. I needed to work on my skills as a storyteller, an audio storyteller. So I developed an exercise which I still use on everything I make, called it the 6 lunch test drive. And what I do is when I go out and I'm working on something or I have a new idea, I will take someone to lunch and I will tell them the story. And then I will watch them very carefully while I'm telling them the story, and I will watch where they kind of look at their watch or out the window, or where they fidget with things, or I listen to the questions they ask me about the story. I listen to where they laugh, where they seem to be moved, where they have an emotional reaction, and I make all these notes in my head. Then I take a second person out to lunch and I tell them the story too. And I've adjusted the story based off of what I experienced telling the first version, and I do that 6 times. Then I write the story. And the 7th version, the one I write, this is for audio, obviously, and you don't always have the luxury of doing this on a daily basis, obviously, but when you're dealing with a feature, you definitely do. That 7th version is as if I was taking a 7th person to lunch. It's finding the way to tell the stories that is important, and I think that, when I look at other people, even in The Daily, there's been a number of other competitors that have come out that have tried to do what The Daily has done, even in this short period of time, having a daily news podcast, and they are neglecting to think about what makes that unique in that space. That how am I talking to someone in the podcast space? You just don't take, I was quite successful during my years at NPR of taking shows that existed on the radio and putting them into podcasts. I'm one of the people who did that, and we did really, really well and still does really, really well. But the ones that do the new things that do exceptionally well are the things that are crafted and tailored for that space. That just aren't simply taking things and putting them in that new space. So I started podcasting, was one of a group of people who started podcasting in 1996. 2006. What am I saying? Sorry, I was thinking, 2006. I'm like, what was I thinking? 20 years ago? No. So 2006, we started podcasting at NPR, and the entire time we were working on that, we were just adding more podcasts to it, trying new things and turning it on. And when 2014, when a lot of things started happening in podcasting, the iOS system and having the podcast app embedded in it, Serial came out. Earlier that year, we were starting to pay a lot more attention to podcasting at NPR because we were seeing a lot of swell of growth before those things happened. And we had 115 podcasts. And the first thing we did was establish rules of what we wanted the values of our podcasts to be. We didn't want things that were pieces of something else. We wanted things that felt right in that experience. So on and so forth, created this list, and we ended up narrowing the list down to 30 podcasts. We've decided that our pathway to success was by eliminating 2/3 of the podcasts we were distributing. We got rid of them, and everybody thought this is a huge mistake. And within 2 months, we had doubled our traffic because we were able to then focus just on those 30 and really kind of invest and answer some of these questions about what makes them unique, what are their engaging characters, what makes them compelling just to listen to. So that's me. If you have more questions, we'll answer them during the panel. Thank you very much.